So my name is Lindsey Kirkland. I'm the coordinator for this session, but I'm also going to serve as a panelist. We're going to structure this a little bit as a panelist or an interactive discussion, hopefully. I work at Climate Generation. It's a nonprofit organization based in Minneapolis, and I am the climate change education manager. My job is to create professional development opportunities for educators across the nation in climate change education. And we view climate justice and climate change education as being reliant on racial and social justice. So we're not going to create climate solutions without having justice and equitable solutions, and as it relates to racial and social inequities. And so that's the perspective I'm bringing today. I'm going to pass it over to Abby for her to introduce herself and her work.
Is my sound coming through okay now, Lindsey? Great. My name is Abby Randall. I am Deputy Director at EcoRise, which is a national nonprofit based out of Austin, Texas, that supports sustainability and climate change education in pre-K through 12 classrooms across the country. And I'm here really speaking through a lens of a science teacher. I'm a former middle and high school science teacher and have done a lot of this work myself. And then also through an environmental and climate justice lens.
Great, thanks, Abby. I see Taylor's here, which is great. I'm going to go ahead and shift it over to Taylor to introduce themselves and their work to our group here.
Great. Apologies if you hear any traffic. I'm actually back at the office for a hot second. My name is Taylor Morton. I'm the Director of Environmental Health and Education at We Act for Environmental Justice. We work on environmental justice and climate justice issues at the local, state, and federal level. And as far as my role and the reason why I'm here, I do a lot of work with our members and our youth around climate justice education and environmental justice education, and making sure that folks are fully prepared to be advocates and organizers around all of these issues that not only relate to climate solutions, but are really linked to equity, justice, and access, and making sure that people have the best quality of life as possible.
Thanks, Taylor. So I was just strategizing a little bit on how to best have our view, and I was trying to pin back and forth, but I think the best is for everyone to put us in gallery mode. And then we can all see each other. I think there's few enough people here. So great. I'm hoping to give us a little bit of grounding in what is climate justice, because I believe it to be perceived and understood, especially from a historical context, in many different ways. And we all come from different experiences, backgrounds. So I'm going to ask Taylor to give us a little perspective on what is climate justice, what's its connection historically to environmental justice, and we can talk about how does it manifest itself in schools right now. So pass it over to Taylor.
Absolutely. So you really can't have climate justice without having environmental justice and understanding the environmental justice movement, especially as the environmental justice movement is very much a child of the civil rights movement, a child of indigenous movements, farmers' rights, workers' rights, all these other movements that really rally around what it means to have access, what it means to have resources, and all of these things really hammer out into what is our life expectancy and quality of life. And when we think about climate justice and making sure that folks who are vulnerable, whether that be to previous environmental injustices or new challenges around climate and due to historic disenfranchisement, historic disinvestment, and all these other reasons, they sit on the place of being first and worst impacted by these issues. The two fit really, really well together. When we think about solutions, especially from a justice standpoint, we really want to make sure that there's not only fair treatment, but meaningful involvement. And especially when we talk about climate justice and solutions, that meaningful involvement can be key to whether or not we're going back later to fix these injustices, to fix access that wasn't given when we tried to implement a solution that that only benefited a certain group of folks. And what we're seeing with youth and in schools as well is this understanding that not only is climate a really big crisis for our young folks, but there are a lot of our young folks who will be disproportionately impacted by these issues, and their families have been impacted by similar issues over such a long period of time that it's not enough to just offer solutions, but we have to make sure that we are factoring all of these pieces around resource distribution, access, and all of these really important keys to understanding how we solve the climate crisis with everyone involved.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Taylor and I was lucky enough to partner with Taylor at a workshop that we gave around this topic. And in that presentation, Taylor, you specifically spoke to how the social justice movement and civil rights movement actually was deeply connected to and rooted in environmental health and safety, which is something that I was not aware of. And it speaks to our skewed perception and like how marginalized narratives from marginalized people have been pushed down in our understanding of the connection of environmental justice. So the impact that Black folks had in demanding environmental justice in like the service industry or in, what was it, like chemical manufacturing plants or things like that. That doesn't get talked about, and the power that comes from our marginalized communities in creating solutions doesn't get talked about as much as it should. And I just remember, Taylor, when you shared that with me, it was so powerful and it really changed my way of understanding this. Yeah, and Abby, I don't know, do you want to add anything to this grounding?
I think that was fantastic grounding, Taylor. Thank you, and it's nice to meet you. I mean, I think I would just echo the idea that it has historically always been communities of color and low-income communities that have been disproportionately impacted by environmental hazards. And so as we start to think about climate justice, it is just part of a greater environmental justice movement where the same systems of oppression and environmental racism are continuing to create conditions where these are just basically new sets of environmental hazards that are having these impacts. And so it's all very much part of the same history that has led to oppression at every level.
Yeah. Thanks. Taylor, any additional things to add to that before we move on? No. Great. And I just want to do a little call out here. If you do have questions and you're attending this discussion, please put them in the chat and I'll try to bring them up as we can and discuss them. So what does this mean for this historical context? Like, what does this mean for how justice manifests itself in the education system or climate change, right? What I experience and understand is climate change comes up in science classrooms, environmental science classrooms. And I'm wondering, is that the place where it should be? Where does justice and climate change and climate justice fit, right, in the curriculum or in schools right now? And if folks want to participate in this part of the discussion, please put it in, like, where are you seeing this come up in your workplaces? And I'm going to ask Abby and Taylor to kind of comment on this.
You want to go first? You want me to go first? We have a program at WEACT called the Environmental Health and Justice Leadership Training Program. It's a program that we developed originally for our adults, understanding that there were adults in our community, and we do a lot of EJ work is like that is what we do. But understanding that there's a barrier to a barrier around literary access, right? When we're thinking about what does it mean to be experiencing poor air quality, but to not know what that means, to not know what the health impacts are, and that our educational system doesn't prepare us to be advocates around this. It doesn't even prepare us to be prepared to save our own lives, right? So we 20 years ago, working with Columbia University, developed this curricula around a couple of key tenets that would really shift our members into becoming leaders. It's hard to be a leader when you're not informed on the material. It's hard to be a leader when you don't have enough information to engage in discussion with elected officials. And we have continued to do that, and it has grown from 5 modules to about 22. And we now do that program with youth in Washington Heights. We're actually expanding to East Harlem this summer, which will be really exciting. But all of that to say, and what I've loved in Washington Heights with our high schoolers there is that we started out in an environmental science classroom and have moved this curriculum around environmental and climate justice to an English classroom, to a history classroom. We did it in civics one year, but it really, and every time that we teach it, right, it takes a different perspective. There's so much to learn about these topics from the historical perspective, from the scientific perspective. And, you know, there's so much that you can do with this work. And I think, especially when we think about engaging students, providing different points of access is always the best option. Maybe you hate, maybe you hate science, right? But trying to do this in an English class would give you more options to engage in this work. And we actually did this program at the same school level. So it was a unit in English, science, and civics at the same time. So students were working on a project where they could sort of take 3 different angles to the work. All of that to say, I think the good thing about environmental justice and climate justice work is that it's very interdisciplinary, and maybe that we don't embrace that enough when we approach that from an educational perspective. In life, it's an interdisciplinary thing. You can get into the science and the politics and the health pieces, but maybe we can be a little bit more flexible when we're taking this approach to schools.
I would absolutely agree with the interdisciplinary nature of, I mean, really just environmental literacy all the way through climate justice. I think at EcoRise, we have traditionally focused on science teachers. About 90% of our teachers that we worked with used to be science teachers. And this past year, it was fewer than 50%. And I think part of that is because of it's a greater awareness and interest from teachers across all disciplines, but also because we've had we've been very targeted in the way that we've designed curriculum and resources and reached out to teachers. And I think particularly with environmental and climate justice, you have an opportunity to go back and look at the history of these movements, like we discussed earlier, looking at redlining and policy, looking at not in my backyard, policies and strategies, and engaging students in conversations about policy and mapping and systemic inequity. Lends itself really nicely to humanities and social studies classrooms, and we're looking at persuasive writing in ELA classrooms. Also, career and technical education and voc tech, I think, is an area that really is important to focus on, creating interest in and green careers. Looking at, we run a green building program for students in architecture and construction courses, understanding the impact that buildings have. They're one of the greatest producers of greenhouse gases, right? They play a huge role in both creating the climate crisis, but also when you look at, mitigation and adaptation strategies. And so engaging students in the built environment from that perspective. And then engineering courses, the engineering design process is such a powerful way to engage students to design solutions to kind of really hyper local place-based challenges that they're facing around the environment and around climate in their schools and in their communities. And so figuring out how to make this relevant, across every discipline. It's actually one of my favorite challenges when a teacher approaches me and says, how do I teach this or make it relevant? It's like, how do you not, but I think broadening it beyond science is really the only way to reach every single one of those students.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you. It also allows us to leverage the skill sets that are taught in each discipline in many and diverse ways to analyze climate change impacts and solution, right? So when we think about science, we use the scientific method, right? Very particular prescribed way of understanding the world. But if we use other disciplines like C3 inquiry process, it's a very different form of analysis. ELA processes relate to culture and personal experience and empowerment through story. So I think having a school or even like a team of educators that work across disciplines in your school and all are tackling climate change or using climate change as their lens for understanding different phenomena in the world is really of value. And there was a question that came up from one of our participants, Tamara, and the way I'm interpreting this a little bit, so I hope I get to this, is like, how are learning outcomes and learning goals for climate change education created? Right. So her question particularly was, are we using NGSS or like, what do we use to create learning outcomes? I can speak from Climate Generation's perspective. We actually use a whole suite of different resources to understand what we believe learning outcomes are in climate change. This year, we actually started doing a little bit deep curriculum coaching, and I've actually put together a list. So I'm going to share that with you in the chat here. This is not for us to deeply look at now, but there's 13 different resources listed at the top. And then Climate Generation has suggested learning outcomes that fall under science and human influence on Earth systems, which would be our typical scientific understanding. But we also have things like, what is the impact of science denial, media literacy, misinformation, and disinformation, right? We also have connections to technical vocations and green careers, workforce development, which Abby was talking about, solutions, right? Climate justice is woven in here, and personal connection to climate change through advocacy and action. So that's just Climate Generation's perspective. I don't know, Abby and Taylor, if you have or if you have very specific resources that you use to inform your ideas around learning outcomes.
I mean, I'll just say that we, engaging in issues around climate and environmental justice is the most authentic, place-based, STEM-based, experiential learning, like whatever educational buzzword or jargon you want to use, it is that, right? So we often work with school districts or schools to understand, like, what standards you're using, what are your academic priorities, what frameworks are you using, and then we basically build it in that way, because it's not, like I said earlier, it's not a stretch, right? And so because we work nationally, we're using a full range, looking at NGSS and Common Core. We work all over the state of Texas, so that's a whole different set of standards.
Yep.
But I think that the Cloud Institute, also looking at that education for sustainability framework. So that's a whole range.
Yeah, I would definitely say that we take a similar approach to you, Abby, and really making our work fit for different schools who have different restraints. And I think the other reality is, I will say this, and you can agree or disagree, but I think in a lot of ways, I don't know if all of the answers to our climate justice issues are like state sanctioned pieces, right? That there's a big part of community learning, things that aren't in our school standards that people need to know. There's a lot, for example, going on with public housing in New York City, and that stuff isn't going to come through standards, and that's where partnerships really work out for us, even if it's just a day of coming into the classroom, even if it's, our EHJLT programming, it's nice enough that we can sort of adjust to a teacher's unit or for a couple of units or whatever specific sort of amount of time. But I think that there's a reality that that there are certain curriculum standards that teachers are held to, educators are held to as a part of their jobs. And I think there's another reality of this work that doing the community work and making sure that students, that youth have what they need, that there are going to be restraints to making sure that happens, especially if it comes out of the community and isn't seen as sanctioned by the state or whatever group, right? Which I think makes this situation really tough. When you do have the tools, you do have the people and the teachers and the educators who come in sort of an unconventional package of making them fit into whatever sort of restrictions your classroom may have.
Yeah, that's great insight, Taylor. I do want to pause and just introduce Ava, who's here with us. Ava is a youth environmental activist with Climate Generation. And so we're coming into the part of the conversation where we're very excited to hear from you, Ava. Do you just want to jump on and introduce yourself real quick?
Yeah, hi, I'm Ava, she, her. I'm with Youth Environmental Activists Minnesota, and we're an organization that focuses a lot on community empowerment and specifically the empowerment of youth to, the education and empowerment of youth when it comes to environmental and social activism. And so, yeah, most of the work we do is in relation to that.
Great, thanks. So Taylor brought up this really good, an example of what a barrier is to teaching climate justice in schools. And I know that Laura Shifter talked a little bit about this in her lead-in, but I want to talk a little bit about some of the barriers that we all hear coming from educators, and then shift into how do we ameliorate or mitigate those barriers a little bit, and who's doing this well, and what kind of support is being provided to get around some of these barriers. And this goes back to Tamara asked another great question of, what are states doing and who's excelling at this as examples or models. So I'm just wondering if folks want to add in specific barriers that they're seeing that prevents folks from teaching about climate justice in the chat. And then I'm going to kick it over to Abby in particular. And I want to ask Abby about this new political ruling, I think in Texas and other states, that prevent educators from teaching about critical race theory or integrating slavery or racism teachings in schools. And how is that impacting your work in climate justice?
Is that for me right now, Lindsey?
If you want, if you're prepared. I didn't tell you I was going to ask you about this.
It's okay. I don't have a lot of answers, but it's something that has been keeping me up at night because we've just released this Introduction to Environmental Justice curriculum, which is heavily focused on systems of oppression and environmental racism and redlining. And I'm just not sure how you can talk about issues of environmental and climate justice without digging into that history and without having really honest conversations with your students about identity and racism and anti-racism. I'll be honest, most of the teachers that we're working with that are in states like this are ignoring those policies. And in some cases, they have principals or superintendents who are supportive of that. And maybe this will just be hopefully a short phase. But that is a real struggle. I mean, we spend most of our time when we work with educators around environmental justice resources, the majority of the time is focused on doing the work with the educators, right? You should not be teaching these topics with your students if you don't have a really good understanding of your own positionality and your own, the effects of environmental injustices in your communities and the role that you play in that, and a comfortability with facilitating those kinds of conversations in a way that empowers students rather than creating any sort of like doom and gloom or feelings of, re-traumatizing students. So Lindsey, I honestly don't have a good answer for you. I think it's incredibly problematic to talk about these topics without using some elements of critical race theory. but it's something that we all have to be very mindful of at the moment, especially I live in Oklahoma and we work in Texas, and it's a big problem.
Yeah. So on a political note here, Ava, I saw you posted in the chat. Do you want to just share a little bit about your experience with your climate justice education bill?
Yeah, so we spent the better part of this year and last fall/winter working on a climate justice education bill that, if passed, would require teachers and schools in Minnesota to incorporate elements of climate justice and like social justice and environmental justice, etc., into their curriculums and into like core classes. And so we got support from a couple, like 10 or so different legislators in the Minnesota House and Senate. And we got the bill drafted and it was introduced, and then it sort of died. And, you know, we pushed really hard for it, but we just didn't get enough support, and it didn't end up getting the hearing it needed before the legislative session ended. And so we sort of concluded that that was really because even the people who supported the bill and authored it still didn't really weren't as passionate about it and didn't think it was as important as we thought it was. And so it didn't have enough momentum, and it stopped there.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a sense of why legislators thought it wasn't a priority this year? Were you in those conversations?
Not so much, but you know, they sort of were all like, you know, this is a really cool idea and it's really important, but it didn't seem like they thought it was important enough. And that's sort of because the goal of the bill is sort of has like a longer term impact with like educating younger generations, and then they grow older and then they use that education to sort of make environmentally conscious choices and continue to be activists or hopefully activists later in life.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not really the same as like different sort of environmental justice bills, which seem to have more of like a now impact. That one is just longer term. It's not less important, it's just longer term. And so it's difficult for people to see that sometimes and understand how longer term impacts are equally as important as short term ones.
Yeah, that's really valuable insight, Ava. Thanks for sharing. Just to put into context, Minnesota doesn't have justice necessarily woven in, but it does have into its curriculum standards, but it does have connections to climate change starting in 6th grade, and also connections to indigenous ways of knowing and traditional ecological knowledge woven in. And that's probably the extent to which it talks about incorporating other ways of knowing or even equitable ways of understanding climate change. And we view ourselves, Minnesota, as a relatively progressive set of science curriculums in terms of justice-based or other ways of understanding science base. And I do know other states that are really progressive right now, and this is New Jersey. If anyone wants to look at curriculum standards to like model off of, New Jersey just revised their science curricula and other curricula to integrate climate change throughout all age groups. And then, as far as I understand, it does a pretty good job of integrating it interdisciplinarily. And then Washington State has great standards, but they also are unique in that their state government provides specific funding to give teachers professional development around this all year long. So they're probably one of the only states that does that in that way. Taylor, I'm wondering if you wanted to add anything to this part of the conversation. We're talking about barriers and ways that different states might be addressing these barriers.
No, I mean, I think the only other, I guess, barrier I can think about is that like we do state and federal work on a lot of different issues. And it seems like there are a lot of interesting ways to sort of approach parts of this when we think about, as Abby mentioned before, like workforce training, especially if we're looking at the big gap of folks who leave and maybe graduate or stay at home or whatever, but like folks 18 through 25, and how to focus some energy on education at that level as it relates to job training, and hoping that there's some opportunities there. Yeah, I mean, the tough part is that like the work has to be done at the federal level as well, and that there's a lot going on. I know in New York State as well, we have our own climate education bills, and there's a lot of difficulty between elections that are coming up, and a lot of work around energy and housing as well. But there have been a lot of bills that have been suggested around climate, but none of them have really had any movement or progress within the past like 2 or 3 years. So there's difficulty even within the climate or environmental sphere, even if we take the educational piece out of that. So sort of hard to, just like environmental justice and climate justices, work is place-based, so are the barriers and the issues, which is a hard and tough reality.
Yeah.
You know, Lindsey, one other thing I'll add, and Taylor, I'm glad you brought it back to workforce, because, and it actually pains me to say this, because sort of the philosophy that EcoRise and personally myself, I've always had is like, in order to do this work systemically, you need to do it in the classroom, right? You need to do it where you have students who are sitting for many hours every day for many years. You need to be doing climate science and climate justice education. And in this current environment, in states where you're not allowed to necessarily talk about these things, doing it out of the classroom and doing it in those workforce development programs, either post, right after high school, or we're doing a lot of work around paid summer internships right now and connecting students to local climate adaptation and mitigation plans. And kind of, as someone in the chat earlier mentioned, kind of peer leadership and peer learning, and having students become these basically climate ambassadors who deeply understand the local policy and application and can really get out in the communities and do some of that engagement and community organizing work, is a very powerful tool in addition to what's being done in the classroom.
And I think that's a great point you bring up, especially when we look at like appropriation funds. So like federal or state funds that can be given to those programs. There are, like, as we all know, there are a lot of really great programs that sort of go to, I was gonna say go to die, but that sounds too gloomy. They go in a dormant space because we don't have funds for them. And it becomes like a whole struggle to keep them alive or like, wake them up again. But that's like, it's also like a tough line to toe, because you miss so many of the students who, like, they can't afford to be in a program because they need to like make money for their families, or just like have money in general, or have other barriers to access. And that is, it's like one of those things that like it works really well. And like, we definitely as an organization, like that's our like go-to, but can be really tough for the students that you miss and the populations that you miss. And that capacity becomes an issue, right? That language justice will always be a thing of making sure that our students are seen around like whatever first languages that they speak or native languages that they speak. So I think that's a great point to bring up, Abby.
Yep. Well, we have under 10 minutes left, and I sort of want to bring this down home, thinking we've talked about high level, right, grounding, we've talked about high level barriers and even in classroom barriers, but now let's talk about some in classroom solutions, right? Abby has brought up, and I think Taylor has mentioned too, like this work can't be done without educators and administrators and folks with this decision-making power in classrooms and schools doing the personal work and changing their practices and understanding the limitations of their skill sets with relation to climate justice and justice education in general. And so I'm hoping that we can talk a little bit about what are some great models for this type of work happening in classrooms or at schools, or what are some good practices? What do educators need to do to be successful at this? or if you have connections to educator groups, like what are they asking for, right? So we are leading our Summer Institute for Climate Change Education at the end of July, and a part of this institute is to center anti-racism work and as it connects to climate change. And what we're hearing from educators when we ask, like, what's challenging about this? A lot of the barriers we've talked about are represented in there, but there's also things like, I just don't feel comfortable. Like, I'm a white educator. I'm not a trusted messenger when it comes to like BIPOC experience. How do I deal with that? There's a lot of really deep-seated challenges on an individual level. And I'm just wondering, as our panelists can provide insight on, like, what do they suggest when they get those questions to educators? And particularly Ava, I'm wondering if you can talk about your ethnic studies work with and just talk generally about what this looks like in classrooms. So maybe I'll pass it over to Ava first. And Ava, do you mind talking a little bit about the Ethnic Studies Initiative with Yeah,
so we sort of, so as you mentioned, Minnesota does have, things in place for climate education, but we were really driving for something that focused more on climate justice, which is like, the people first perspective with climate issues. Like, not only does climate change hurt the environment, but it hurts people, and it hurts, poor communities globally. And so when you're talking about climate issues, you have to think about that as well. And so we focused a lot on that when we were drafting our bill and when we were working on it. And one of our main goals was that if the bill got implemented, that kids in classrooms would learn about how, different climate tragedies don't only affect the environment and wildlife and plant life, but affect people, and again, specifically, like, marginalized, poor communities really are hurt the most by it.
can you talk a little bit about, I'm not sure if you were involved in the role of like the ethnic studies and how ethnic studies connects here? Like,
I wasn't, no.
Okay. Yeah, so I can talk a little bit about it. As far as I know, several youth leaders and are supporting bills and district-wide changes and developing ethnic studies programs in their schools to be these places of interdisciplinary exploration of climate justice. And because their school was unable to integrate climate change throughout, they actually view ethnic studies as a place to understand the cultural underpinnings of climate impacts and how people respond to that from a climatological or anthropological, historical, and interdisciplinary viewpoint. So that's been one strategy that they've focused on, I think this year a little bit.
Echo earlier something that came up in the chat around, someone mentioned book clubs, and I think, having racial affinity or racial identity groups can be really powerful in an educational setting. It has to be done with intention, right, and a little bit of research. But especially speaking as a white teacher, a former white teacher, most teachers don't come into the profession with a deep understanding of the bias that they bring, or a real understanding of the depth of oppression and inequality that exists. And so having a space where for white educators, you can support one another to start to uncover those biases so that you can better have these discussions in your classroom, whether you're working with white students or BIPOC students, but just getting comfortable with being in conversation and having an anti-racist stance, and really approaching with you know, a perspective of humility, right? And like, no matter how much work you have done or you think you've done, it doesn't, you're just scratching the surface. And I think creating a support network to help you do that. And there's a ton of great organizations that do that. And sort of the benefit of the virtual world is that you can join all sorts of different organizations who are doing anti-racism work. Equity in the Center is one that does really excellent trainings, just to kind of, for people who want to start on their anti-racism journey or deepen their anti-racism journey. But I think really backing up to do that work before you're engaging in those conversations with your students is essential.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is just making sure that you know, on the topic of relearning, what your local EJ issues are and what your local climate issues are. There's a really deep storied history wherever you are, I promise. But if you don't have clarity on what those are, you may know, like, all right, well, clean air is an issue, but there's always a deeper story that can lead to a better understanding of what your students will be facing and what community issues are. I just dropped a book in the chat by Harriet Washington, highly recommend. It's a very good book. It's a good foundation for learning more about environmental justice, and it leads to topics about climate justice as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Taylor. And thanks, everyone. Thanks all of our panelists here. We're at my time 1:45, but I think we're supposed to be end at the 1:45 mark. So I guess I'm going to ask any of the panelists, if you have resources that you want to put in the chat now, go for it, and we'll make sure it gets into the Padlet, into the notes doc. I'm actually going to drop another one called the Mapping Inequality Project, which is a great resource for like exploring redlining and environmental injustice from a historical perspective. Put that in there. Oops, not that one. Anyway, I'll pop that in and we'll make sure it gets into the resources. And in the last 10 seconds, I want to say thank you to everyone, and I hope this was helpful.